In the dimly lit chambers of the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, a man sat hunched over parchment, his quill scratching against the silence of the night. The year was 1513, and Niccolò Machiavelli, once a trusted advisor to the Florentine Republic, now found himself in exile, stripped of power and fortune. Yet it was precisely in this moment of personal defeat that he would craft the most enduring manual on political power ever written. The candle flickered as Machiavelli paused, reflecting on the brutal realities he had witnessed throughout his career as a diplomat and secretary to the Second Chancery. He had seen republics crumble, princes rise and fall, and armies march across the Italian peninsula, leaving devastation in their wake. The romantic notions of honor, virtue, and noble governance that filled the philosophical treatises of his time seemed laughably naive when measured against the harsh mathematics of political survival. What emerged from those sleepless nights was not merely a book, but a revolutionary understanding of power that would shake the foundations of Western political thought. The Prince, as it would come to be known, was not written for the faint-hearted or the idealistic. It was a surgeon's guide to the body politic, unflinching in its examination of power's most uncomfortable truths. The first savage teaching that Machiavelli unveiled was perhaps the most shocking to his contemporaries: the complete separation of political effectiveness from traditional Christian morality. For centuries, political theorists had struggled to reconcile the demands of governance with the teachings of the Church. They had written elaborate justifications for why rulers must be virtuous, pious, and just. Machiavelli swept away these comfortable illusions with a single, devastating observation: since it is difficult to unite them in one person, it is much safer to be feared than loved, when, of the two, either must be dispensed with. This was not the cynicism of a bitter man, but the clear-eyed analysis of someone who had witnessed the collapse of the Florentine Republic precisely because its leaders had chosen to be loved rather than feared. Piero Soderini, the Gonfalonier of Florence, had been a good man by every traditional measure: honest, compassionate, and dedicated to justice. Yet his very virtues had rendered him impotent when faced with the machinations of the Medici family and their papal allies. Goodness, Machiavelli realized, was often the enemy of effectiveness. The implications of this insight rippled through every aspect of political behavior. If traditional virtue could be a liability, then, perhaps what the world called vice might sometimes be necessary for the preservation of the state. A prince who refused to lie when circumstances demanded it would find his kingdom overrun by those more willing to embrace deception. A leader who could not bring himself to execute traitors would soon find his throne occupied by those very traitors. This led to Machiavelli's second fundamental insight: the concept of virtue, which he distinguished sharply from virtue. While virtue implied adherence to moral absolutes, virtue represented something far more dangerous and powerful: the ability to adapt one's behavior to circumstances, to be both fox and lion as the situation required. The leader possessed of virtue was not bound by the chains of consistency or the comfort of moral certainties. Instead, they wielded a terrible flexibility that allowed them to survive in an environment where rigid adherence to any single mode of behavior was a recipe for destruction. Consider the example of Cesare Borgia, whom Machiavelli studied with the fascination of a naturalist observing a particularly successful predator. Borgia had carved out a domain in central Italy through a combination of audacity, brutality, and cunning that would have been impossible for a conventionally virtuous ruler. When he needed allies, he could be generous and charming. When betrayal served his purposes, he could orchestrate the murder of his own supporters without hesitation. When his enemies expected mercy, he showed them the blade. When they prepared for war, he offered them treaties. The key to understanding Borgia's success, Machiavelli argued, lay not in any particular action, but in his refusal to be constrained by others' expectations of how a prince should behave. He remained uncontrolled by the conventional wisdom of his time, and this very unpredictability became a source of immense power. His enemies could never be certain which Cesare they would encounter: the diplomat or the warrior, the ally or the assassin. Yet Machiavelli's analysis went deeper than simple advocacy for duplicity. He recognized that power operates according to its own logic, independent of human wishes or moral preferences. Just as a river follows the path of least resistance while carving through mountain ranges, political power flows through channels determined by fear, interest, and opportunity rather than justice or righteousness. The successful prince learns to read these currents and navigate them skillfully, rather than exhausting himself in futile attempts to redirect the river's course. This understanding led to what many consider Machiavelli's most disturbing insight: the instrumentalization of human nature itself. Rather than seeing people as souls to be saved or rational beings to be persuaded, the effective ruler learns to view them as materials to be shaped and directed. Human beings, Machiavelli observed, are naturally inclined toward selfishness, cowardice, and deception. They will break their word whenever it serves their interest, abandon their leaders at the first sign of weakness, and betray their closest friends for sufficient advantage. This was not a condemnation of humanity, but a realistic assessment that the wise ruler ignores at their peril. The prince who governs based on what people ought to be rather than what they actually are will find himself ruling over a fantasy kingdom that exists only in his imagination. Meanwhile, in the real world, his throne will be occupied by someone with fewer illusions about human nature. The practical implications of this insight were revolutionary. If people are fundamentally unreliable, then, the smart ruler creates systems that align their self-interest with the state's objectives rather than relying on their loyalty or virtue. Instead of trusting in the goodness of his subjects, the successful prince ensures that betraying him is more costly than serving him. Instead of assuming that appointed officials will act in the public interest, the wise ruler creates mechanisms that make personal advancement dependent on effective governance. This systematic approach to human motivation represented a fundamental break with medieval political theory, which had assumed that good government flowed naturally from good rulers. Machiavelli argued instead that good government required good systems, structures of incentive and consequence that would produce beneficial outcomes regardless of the personal character of those operating within them. The implications extended far beyond individual rulers to the nature of political institutions themselves. A republic that depended on the virtue of its citizens was ultimately more fragile than a principality that depended on the self-interest of its subjects. Virtue was rare and unpredictable, self-interest was universal and reliable. The wise constitution maker would build on the foundation of self-interest rather than hoping for the miracle of widespread virtue. This instrumental view of human nature led to Machiavelli's third major insight: the centrality of violence in political life. Modern readers often recoil from his casual discussions of assassination, execution, and warfare, interpreting them as evidence of moral corruption. But Machiavelli saw violence as simply another tool in the political toolkit, to be employed when circumstances warranted it and avoided when other methods proved more effective. The crucial distinction was between violence that served the state and violence that served only personal passion. The prince who executed conspirators after uncovering their plot was performing a necessary function of governance, protecting the stability that allowed thousands of citizens to live in peace. The prince who tortured prisoners for his own amusement was indulging in mere cruelty. One served the larger good, the other served only the self. This instrumental approach to violence required its own kind of discipline. The effective ruler learned to employ force precisely and efficiently, without the wasteful excess that characterized mere brutality. When Cesare Borgia appointed Ramiro de Orco to pacify the Romagna, he gave him unlimited authority to restore order through whatever means necessary. De Orco succeeded brilliantly, but his very success made him a liability. The people associated him with the harsh measures required for pacification. So Borgia had him executed and his body displayed in the town square, simultaneously demonstrating that justice had been done while maintaining the benefits of de Orco's earlier work. The genius of this maneuver lay not in its cruelty, but in its efficiency. With a single action, Borgia had eliminated a potential rival, satisfied the people's desire for justice, and reinforced his own authority. The violence was surgical, precisely calibrated to achieve multiple political objectives with minimal expenditure of force. This calculated approach to violence reflected Machiavelli's broader understanding of timing in political action. Just as a military commander must know when to attack and when to retreat, the political leader must understand the rhythms of opportunity and danger that govern public life. There are moments when mercy strengthens authority and others when it invites catastrophe. The art lies not in choosing between kindness and cruelty in the abstract, but in recognizing which circumstances call for which response. Such timing requires an almost supernatural sensitivity to the political environment. The successful prince must read the subtle signs that indicate shifts in public mood, the emergence of new threats, or the opening of unexpected opportunities. This political intuition cannot be reduced to simple rules or formulas. It requires the kind of practical wisdom that comes only from deep engagement with the realities of power. The development of this political sensitivity led Machiavelli to his fourth crucial insight: the paramount importance of controlling information and perception. In a world where appearance often matters more than reality, the wise ruler becomes a master of theatrical statecraft. They understand that being powerful is less important than appearing powerful, that being feared matters more than being actually dangerous, and that seeming virtuous can be more valuable than being virtuous. This emphasis on perception over reality represented another radical departure from traditional political theory. Medieval thinkers had generally assumed that good governance would naturally produce good results that would be recognized by the people. Machiavelli argued instead that the relationship between policy and perception was far more complex and manipulable. A successful ruler could maintain power even while pursuing policies that harmed the general welfare, provided they maintained control over how those policies were perceived and understood. The mechanisms of this control were varied and sophisticated. Sometimes it involved the careful timing of announcements, ensuring that bad news was delivered when the public was distracted by other concerns. Sometimes it required the creation of scapegoats, convenient targets who could be blamed for problems actually caused by the ruler's own policies. Often it demanded the cultivation of a public persona that bore little resemblance to the ruler's private character but served important political functions. Lorenzo de' Medici, for example, had maintained his unofficial control over Florence partly through an elaborate performance of civic virtue and artistic patronage that masked his systematic undermining of republican institutions. The citizens saw a generous patron of the arts and a wise counselor. They did not see the careful manipulation of electoral processes and the gradual concentration of power in Medici hands. By the time the reality became apparent, it was too late for effective resistance. This theatrical dimension of politics extended to the realm of religious observance and moral display. Machiavelli noted that successful rulers often made a great show of piety and virtue, not because these qualities were necessary for effective governance, but because they were necessary for political survival in societies that expected such displays from their leaders. The prince who failed to attend mass regularly or who openly flouted moral conventions would find himself at a severe disadvantage compared to rivals who understood the importance of maintaining proper appearances. Yet this emphasis on perception created its own dangers. The ruler who became too skilled at manipulation might lose touch with underlying realities, mistaking his own propaganda for truth. The prince who spent all his energy on managing appearances might neglect the substance of governance, allowing real problems to fester while he maintained the illusion of competence. The art lay in using theatrical techniques without being deceived by one's own performance. Part 2: The Architecture of Uncontrolled Power. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Tuscan countryside as Machiavelli contemplated the deeper implications of his emerging philosophy. If traditional morality was insufficient as a guide to political action, and if human nature was fundamentally unreliable, then what principles could guide the aspiring ruler? The answer lay not in abstract ideals, but in the careful study of power's own internal logic. Power, Machiavelli realized, was not simply a tool to be picked up and used at will. It was a living force with its own requirements and imperatives, its own patterns of growth and decay. Just as a gardener must understand the nature of the plants in his care, their seasons of growth, their vulnerabilities to disease, their requirements for light and water, the political leader must learn to work with power's natural tendencies rather than against them. This organic understanding of power led to Machiavelli's fifth major insight: the necessity of remaining uncontrolled by others' expectations and systems. The moment a ruler allows his actions to be dictated by external authorities, whether religious, moral, or political, he surrenders the very flexibility that makes effective governance possible. He becomes predictable, and predictability is the enemy of political survival. Consider the fate of Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar who had briefly ruled Florence through moral authority and religious fervor. Savonarola's power had been real and impressive, capable of inspiring thousands of citizens to burn their luxury goods in the famous bonfire of the vanities. Yet his very commitment to spiritual principles had made him vulnerable to those who understood the importance of temporal flexibility. When political circumstances shifted and his religious message no longer resonated with the people's immediate concerns, he had no alternative tools to maintain his authority. His unwillingness to compromise his spiritual vision for political necessity led directly to his execution in the Piazza della Signoria. The lesson was clear: principles, however noble, become chains when they prevent adaptation to changing circumstances. The ruler who proclaimed that he would never negotiate with enemies had eliminated a potentially valuable tool before the game even began. The prince who swore always to keep his word had handicapped himself in dealing with those who felt no such constraints. The leader who committed himself to governing through persuasion alone had abandoned the option of coercion when persuasion proved insufficient. This did not mean that the successful ruler operated without any principles whatsoever. Rather, it meant that his ultimate principle was the preservation and expansion of his power, which might require the tactical abandonment of lesser principles when circumstances demanded it. The wise prince learned to hold his moral commitments lightly, ready to adjust them as the political environment shifted. Such flexibility required a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between appearance and reality in political life. The ruler might need to appear bound by moral constraints while maintaining the practical freedom to ignore them when necessary. He might need to seem committed to democratic consultation while preserving the ability to act unilaterally when speed was essential. The art lay in maintaining the illusion of consistency while practicing the reality of adaptation. This theatrical aspect of political leadership connected to Machiavelli's sixth crucial insight, the importance of cultivating multiple, seemingly contradictory personas. The effective ruler was not a single, coherent character, but rather a shapeshifter capable of presenting different faces to different audiences as circumstances required. With his soldiers, he might be the bold commander, inspiring through personal courage and tactical brilliance. With foreign ambassadors, he could be the sophisticated diplomat, impressing through cultural refinement and intellectual sophistication. With his subjects, he might appear as the benevolent father figure, concerned primarily with their welfare and prosperity. The key was ensuring that each audience saw only the version of the prince that served his political objectives with that particular group. The soldiers did not need to know about his diplomatic subtleties, the diplomats did not need to witness his military ruthlessness, the subjects did not need to understand the harsh calculations that governed his decision-making. Each group received the truth they needed to see, while the full reality remained the prince's private knowledge. This compartmentalization of personality required extraordinary self-discipline and psychological sophistication. The ruler had to maintain awareness of which version of himself he was presenting at any given moment, ensuring that he never allowed inappropriate elements to bleed through. A moment of military bluntness during delicate diplomatic negotiations could destroy months of careful relationship building. An inappropriate display of compassion when decisive action was required could be interpreted as weakness by those whose respect depended on their fear. Yet the benefits of such psychological flexibility were enormous. The prince who had mastered this art became virtually impossible for enemies to anticipate or counter. They could never be certain which aspect of his personality would manifest in any given situation, and this uncertainty itself became a weapon. Opponents who prepared for the diplomat might find themselves facing the warrior, those who expected the tyrant might encounter the benevolent patron. In each case, their preparations would prove inadequate, leaving them off balance and vulnerable. The cultivation of multiple personas also served defensive purposes. If one aspect of the prince's public image became politically liability, he could emphasize other aspects while allowing the problematic elements to fade into the background. The ruler who had been criticized for excessive harshness could begin emphasizing his role as cultural patron and economic developer. The prince who had been attacked as weak could demonstrate his military capabilities while de-emphasizing his diplomatic inclinations. This strategic approach to self-presentation reflected Machiavelli's broader understanding of politics as a form of warfare conducted through nonviolent means. Just as military commanders sought to achieve their objectives with minimal expenditure of resources and lives, the political leader aimed to accomplish his goals with the least possible disruption to existing power structures and social relationships. Violence was always an option, but it was often the most expensive and unpredictable option available. The preference for nonviolent methods led to Machiavelli's seventh major insight, the supreme importance of intelligence and information in political competition. Knowledge was power in the most literal sense. The ruler who understood his environment better than his competitors possessed decisive advantages that could often substitute for superior resources or more favorable circumstances. This intelligence function operated on multiple levels. At the most basic level, the prince needed accurate information about immediate threats and opportunities. Which nobles were plotting against him? Which foreign powers were considering military action? Which economic trends might affect his tax revenues? This tactical intelligence allowed for rapid response to developing situations before they could mature into serious challenges. But, truly sophisticated political intelligence went far beyond simple information gathering. It involved developing deep understanding of the psychological, cultural, and economic forces that shaped political behavior in his society. Why did certain groups support particular policies? What historical experiences had shaped their current attitudes? How might changes in economic conditions affect their political loyalties? This strategic intelligence enabled the prince to anticipate political developments rather than merely reacting to them. The most successful rulers created extensive intelligence networks that penetrated every level of society. Merchants provided information about economic conditions and foreign trade. Clergy reported on popular attitudes and emerging social movements. Military officers shared intelligence about potential external threats and the loyalty of their subordinates. Court officials revealed the private conversations and hidden agendas of potential rivals. Yet the value of such networks depended on the prince's ability to analyze and synthesize the information they provided. Raw intelligence was often contradictory, incomplete, or deliberately misleading. The art lay in recognizing patterns, identifying reliable sources, and distinguishing between signal and noise in the constant flow of reports and rumors that reached the ruler's attention. This analytical challenge led to one of Machiavelli's most sophisticated insights: the danger of becoming trapped within one's own information systems. The prince who relied too heavily on a narrow circle of advisors risked losing touch with realities that those advisors either could not perceive or chose not to report. The ruler who listened only to good news would eventually be blindsided by problems that his courtiers had been reluctant to acknowledge. The leader who trusted only in official reports might miss the underground currents of opinion that would ultimately determine his political survival. The solution required creating multiple, independent channels of information that could provide cross-checks and alternative perspectives on developing situations. The wise prince cultivated sources among his enemies as well as his friends, among the lowly as well as the powerful, among the critical as well as the supportive. He learned to read between the lines of official reports and to pay attention to seemingly insignificant details that might reveal larger truths about his political environment. Such sophistication in intelligence gathering and analysis provided the foundation for Machiavelli's eighth crucial insight: the importance of timing in political action. Even the most brilliant strategies could fail if implemented at the wrong moment, while mediocre plans might succeed brilliantly if their timing aligned with favorable circumstances. The prince who understood the rhythms of political opportunity could accomplish with minimal effort what might be impossible under different conditions. Political timing operated according to multiple, overlapping cycles. There were the seasonal rhythms of economic activity, which affected both the resources available for political action and the public's mood regarding taxation and military service. There were the generational cycles of leadership change, which created opportunities for new alliances and the abandonment of old commitments. There were the longer historical cycles of institutional development and decay, which determined what kinds of political arrangements were sustainable over extended periods. The skilled political actor learned to read these various cycles and to position his major initiatives at moments when multiple favorable trends converged. The prince who launched a military campaign when harvests were abundant, enemies were distracted by internal conflicts, and his own authority was at its peak had created the best possible conditions for success. The ruler who attempted the same campaign during economic hardship, when his enemies were united and his own supporters were questioning his judgment, had virtually guaranteed failure regardless of the objective merits of his strategy. Yet timing was not simply a matter of waiting for ideal conditions, which might never arise. Often it required creating favorable circumstances through preliminary actions designed to shape the political environment. The wise prince might spend months or years positioning various pieces before making his decisive move, ensuring that when the crucial moment arrived, all necessary elements would be in place. This patient approach to political action distinguished the master strategist from the mere opportunist. The opportunist seized whatever chances presented themselves without regard for longer-term consequences. The strategist created opportunities through careful preparation and, then, exploited them with devastating efficiency. Where the opportunist was reactive, the strategist was proactive. Where the opportunist was impulsive, the strategist was disciplined. Part 3: The Eternal Dance of Power and Freedom. As autumn descended upon the Florentine hills, Machiavelli found himself grappling with the ultimate implications of his analysis. If power operated according to its own logic, independent of moral considerations, then what distinguished the successful ruler from the mere tyrant? The answer lay in understanding power not as an end in itself, but as a means to creating and preserving the conditions within which human flourishing became possible. This insight led to Machiavelli's ninth and, perhaps most profound teaching, the paradoxical relationship between power and freedom. The ruler who wielded absolute authority over others was, in many ways, the least free person in the realm. Every action was scrutinized for political implications. Every relationship was potentially compromised by considerations of advantage and betrayal. Every moment of relaxation created opportunities for enemies to advance their schemes. The price of power was eternal vigilance, and the cost of eternal vigilance was the sacrifice of spontaneous human connection. Yet this burden was not merely personal, it was functional. The prince's willingness to sacrifice his own freedom made possible the freedom of his subjects to pursue their private interests without constant concern for political survival. The merchant could focus on trade rather than warfare. The farmer could tend his fields rather than fortifying his home. The scholar could pursue knowledge rather than plotting against rivals. All of this became possible because someone else had accepted the terrible responsibility of maintaining the political order that protected such peaceful activities. This understanding transformed the entire framework within which Machiavelli evaluated political action. The prince's apparent cruelty in executing conspirators was actually an act of public service, preventing the civil war that would have resulted from successful rebellion. His deception of foreign ambassadors protected his people from the predations of more powerful neighbors. His manipulation of domestic political processes maintained the stability that allowed economic prosperity and cultural development to flourish. The successful ruler thus became a kind of secular priest, sacrificing his own moral purity for the greater good of society. Just as the physician must sometimes cause pain to heal disease, the prince must sometimes employ harsh methods to preserve peace. The alternative was not moral governance, but chaos, the breakdown of all governance and the return to the state of nature where life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This sacrificial understanding of political leadership connected to Machiavelli's 10th major insight, the importance of building institutions that could survive the ruler's personal limitations and eventual death. A prince who governed effectively during his lifetime but failed to create sustainable systems had ultimately failed in his fundamental responsibility. His personal virtue, however impressive, would die with him, leaving his subjects vulnerable to the chaos and conflict that typically accompanied succession crises. The challenge was creating institutions that could function effectively regardless of the personal character of those who operated them. This required moving beyond the medieval model of personal rule, where governance depended entirely on the virtue and wisdom of individual monarchs, toward something more systematic and predictable. The wise prince would establish legal codes, administrative procedures, and military organizations that would continue to serve the public interest even under less capable successors. Yet this institutionalization process created its own dilemmas. Strong institutions might constrain the prince's own freedom of action, preventing him from responding quickly to new challenges or opportunities. Bureaucratic procedures that ensured fair treatment of citizens might also create inefficiencies that weakened the state in competition with more nimble rivals. Legal protections that prevented arbitrary rule might also protect genuine enemies of the state from necessary punishment. The resolution lay in creating institutions that were strong enough to function independently but flexible enough to be modified when circumstances required it. This meant building in mechanisms for controlled change, procedures for updating laws, reorganizing administrative structures, and adapting military forces to new technologies and tactics. The goal was not rigid permanence but sustainable adaptability. Such institutional design required the prince to think beyond his own lifetime and immediate interests. He had to consider what kinds of challenges future rulers might face and what tools they would need to address those challenges effectively. This long-term perspective distinguished the true statesman from the mere politician, who focused only on short-term survival and advantage. The emphasis on institutional sustainability led to Machiavelli's 11th insight, the crucial importance of civic education and cultural development. A state populated by ignorant, passive subjects might be easier to control in the short term, but it would ultimately prove weaker than one populated by educated, engaged citizens capable of understanding and supporting the rationale for government policies. This did not mean that the prince should encourage unlimited freedom of expression or democratic participation in decision-making. Rather, it meant cultivating a citizenry that understood the connection between their private welfare and the state's success. Citizens who grasped the economic benefits of political stability would be more willing to pay taxes and serve in the military. Subjects who understood the external threats facing their state would be more tolerant of necessary restrictions on their liberty. A population that appreciated the cultural achievements made possible by political order would be more willing to defend that order against its enemies. The mechanisms for such civic education were varied and sophisticated. Public ceremonies and festivals could reinforce shared values and collective identity. Architectural projects could demonstrate the state's power and permanence while providing employment for citizens. Support for arts and learning could create cultural achievements that enhanced the state's prestige while developing the intellectual capabilities of its population. Yet the most effective civic education was often indirect, embedded in the daily experience of good governance rather than proclaimed through explicit propaganda. Citizens who experienced efficient administration, fair courts, and effective protection from crime and external threats learned to value the political order that made such benefits possible. Subjects who saw their economic opportunities expand under stable government developed a stake in maintaining that stability. This experiential approach to civic education connected to Machiavelli's 12th and final major insight, the ultimate dependence of political success on the consent of the governed. However, absolute a ruler's theoretical authority might be, his practical ability to govern depended on the cooperation, or at least the acquiescence, of his subjects. A prince who faced universal hostility from his population would find himself isolated and vulnerable, regardless of his personal capabilities or the sophistication of his political techniques. This dependence on popular consent created another paradox. The ruler who sought to maximize his control over his subjects often ended up weakening his actual power over them. Excessive taxation might fill the royal treasury in the short term but would ultimately impoverish the economy that generated those taxes. Harsh repression might eliminate immediate threats but would create underground networks of resistance that could prove even more dangerous. Constant surveillance might prevent open opposition but would destroy the trust necessary for effective administration. The wise prince learned to govern with a light touch, using his authority selectively and strategically rather than asserting it continuously. He understood that power, like any finite resource, was depleted through use and had to be carefully conserved for moments when it was truly necessary. The ruler who executed every political opponent would eventually run out of capable administrators. The prince who broke every promise would eventually find no one willing to negotiate with him. The leader who trusted no one would eventually find himself surrounded only by those who had no choice but to remain loyal. This conservation of political capital required the same kind of strategic thinking that governed military campaigns. Just as a general had to husband his forces for decisive battles rather than wasting them in meaningless skirmishes, the political leader had to reserve his most coercive powers for situations where gentler methods had proved inadequate. The goal was not to avoid the use of force entirely, but to use it so precisely and effectively that future resort to force would become unnecessary. The ultimate test of such political artistry lay not in the prince's ability to dominate his subjects, but in his capacity to align their interests with his own. The ruler who achieved this alignment could govern through persuasion and incentive rather than coercion and punishment. His subjects would support his policies not because they feared the consequences of opposition, but because they understood that their own welfare depended on the success of his initiatives. Such alignment was never perfect or permanent. Individual interests would always diverge from collective interests in some areas, and the prince would always need mechanisms for managing such conflicts. External threats would periodically require sacrifices that citizens might prefer to avoid. Economic crises would force difficult choices about the allocation of scarce resources. The art lay in maintaining enough goodwill and credibility to secure voluntary cooperation during such challenging periods. The achievement of this delicate balance between authority and consent represented the highest expression of political virtue. It required all of the skills that Machiavelli had analyzed throughout his career, the strategic intelligence to understand complex political environments, the psychological sophistication to motivate diverse groups of people, the tactical flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances, the moral courage to make difficult decisions, and the long-term vision to build institutions that would outlast any individual ruler. Yet perhaps the most essential quality was the one that Machiavelli had identified at the very beginning of his analysis: the willingness to remain uncontrolled by external expectations and conventional wisdom. The prince who allowed his actions to be dictated by traditional moral authorities, popular prejudices, or established precedents would inevitably find himself outmaneuvered by more flexible competitors. Only by maintaining the freedom to think and act independently could he hope to navigate the treacherous currents of political life successfully. This independence of thought and action was not license for arbitrary rule or self-indulgent behavior. Rather, it was the foundation for truly responsive governance, the kind of leadership that could anticipate problems before they became crises, recognize opportunities before they were obvious to everyone else, and adapt established practices to meet unprecedented challenges. The legacy of such leadership extended far beyond the immediate success or failure of any particular ruler. By demonstrating what became possible when intelligence, flexibility, and determination were combined with institutional authority, the effective prince created models that could inspire future generations of leaders. By building institutions that survived his own death, he contributed to the gradual evolution of political systems toward greater sophistication and effectiveness. Most importantly, by accepting the moral burden of political responsibility, the necessity of sometimes acting in ways that violated conventional ethical standards in order to preserve the larger good, the wise ruler protected others from having to make such tragic choices. The citizens who criticized their prince's harshness were free to maintain their own moral purity precisely because someone else had accepted the corruption that governance sometimes required. In this light, Machiavelli's savage teachings revealed themselves as ultimately humanitarian. They were not instructions for tyranny, but rather a clear-eyed analysis of what was required to prevent tyranny, to maintain the kind of political order that protected human dignity and enabled human flourishing. The prince who mastered these teachings did not become a monster, he became the guardian who stood between civilization and the monsters that would destroy it if given the chance. The darkness that Machiavelli illuminated was not the darkness of human evil, but the darkness of human ignorance about the true nature of political life. By bringing these uncomfortable truths into the light, by analyzing them systematically and dispassionately, he provided future generations with the knowledge they would need to build better, stronger, more humane political systems. The power that remained uncontrolled by false moral constraints was not unlimited power, but rather power disciplined by reality, power informed by accurate understanding of human nature and political possibility. Such power was indeed terrible in its scope and implications, but it was also the only power capable of creating and preserving the conditions within which human beings could live together peacefully, prosperously, and with dignity. In accepting this terrible responsibility, in refusing the comfortable illusions that made political action easier but less effective, Machiavelli's ideal prince embodied a harsh but necessary form of public service. He sacrificed his own moral innocence so that others could maintain theirs. He accepted the isolation that came with ultimate responsibility so that others could enjoy the benefits of community. He embraced the burden of making tragic choices so that others could live in a world where such choices were unnecessary. This was the final paradox of Machiavelli's political philosophy, that the preservation of human goodness required someone to step outside the boundaries of conventional goodness. The maintenance of moral order demanded someone willing to act beyond traditional moral constraints. The protection of innocence necessitated someone prepared to sacrifice his own innocence. In understanding and accepting this paradox, the successful ruler achieved a form of greatness that was invisible to those who benefited from it. His very success in maintaining political order made that order seem natural and effortless to his subjects. They took for granted the peace that he protected and the prosperity that he fostered, never fully grasping the skill and sacrifice required to make such benefits possible. Yet this invisibility was itself a mark of true political artistry. The ruler who governed so skillfully that his governance appeared effortless had achieved the highest level of professional mastery. Like the greatest athletes, who made extraordinary feats appear routine, or the greatest artists, who concealed their technique behind seemingly spontaneous creation, the master politician made the enormously complex task of governance appear simple and natural. This was Niccolò Machiavelli's ultimate gift to posterity, not a manual for tyranny, but a revelation of the true complexity and difficulty of just governance. In stripping away the comfortable illusions that had long obscured the realities of political life, he provided future generations with the knowledge they would need to govern wisely and effectively. His savage teachings were, in the end, profoundly civilizing, not because they made politics gentler, but because they made it more honest, more intelligent, and more likely to serve the authentic needs of human communities. The prince who remained uncontrolled by false expectations and impossible ideals was free to create genuine solutions to real problems. The leader who understood power's true nature could wield it more skillfully and more responsibly than those who approached it with naive assumptions or wishful thinking. The ruler who accepted the moral complexity of governance could navigate its challenges with wisdom rather than being paralyzed by abstract principles that bore little relation to concrete circumstances. In this way, Machiavelli's dark vision ultimately pointed toward light, not the false illumination of easy answers and comfortable certainties, but the genuine enlightenment that came from seeing clearly, thinking honestly, and acting with full awareness of the consequences and responsibilities that political power entailed. It was a harsh curriculum, but it was the only education adequate to the demands of leadership in a world where the stakes were measured in human lives and human freedom. Thus concluded the Florentine's meditation on power and its proper employment. In the centuries that followed, his insights would be condemned and praised, misunderstood and misapplied, but never successfully refuted. For he had identified something eternal in the human condition, the tragic necessity of wielding imperfect power in service of imperfect ideals, in a world that offered no perfect solutions to its enduring problems. His legacy was not a recipe for tyranny, but a map of the treacherous terrain that every responsible leader must learn to navigate. And in that navigation lay both the burden and the glory of political life.